Good afternoon, and welcome to our third webcast, noontime webcast, sponsored by Brand Live. My name is DJ Nets, and I'm the president of the ATD Cascadia chapter. And it's my pleasure to introduce this learning event delivered through this great technology. Through this webcast, you'll be able to ask questions. So be sure if you have questions or you want to contribute to type them into the chat box, and we will respond in real time. And today we have Kristen Gallagher, founder of Edify, who's going to give us a great presentation on human-centered design for learning practitioners. So thank you, Kristen.
Thank you. I appreciate
Thanks.
it. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you for being here, and thank you ATD for inviting me, and also for Brand Life for hosting us. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to talk about human-centered design for learning practitioners. So the structure of our webcast today will be in three parts. We'll talk about the objectives and what I'm hoping you'll get out of this. We'll talk about what you're actually going to learn, and we'll actually do some work too. Okay, so we're not going to answer this too much because this is a little quieter than a normal in-person workshop, but I'm asking you to think about, why are you here? Why did you decide to show up today? And what's one thing that you'd like to leave with at the end of the workshop? If you do have thoughts about what you'd like to leave with at the end of the workshop, write those in and DJ will share them with me so we can share them with everyone else. All right, do we have any suggestions?
No, not yet.
All right, well, I can talk about some of the reasons that folks usually come to this workshop that I run. And typically it's because people are interested in new models of instructional design. And I'm not actually going to talk about instructional design as a tool set or a technique, but I am going to talk about using a framework for thinking about instructional design and for learning and development in general. So hopefully that is something that you're interested in learning about. And if you've got questions, I'll be around to answer questions later as well. Okay, so what I'm hoping you'll learn today is to understand the fundamentals of human-centered design as a methodology, as a concept. And I'm also hoping that you can take away a personal toolkit for applying HCD in your learning design process. So attached to the Brand Live link you got is probably a PDF, and you can download that PDF. You don't need to follow along with it, but it is there for you if you'd like to have it. Okay, so let's get started. So what is HCD? It is a methodology, it's an idea generator, and it's a solution driver. So I find human-centered design to be a great way to interact with the business. And sometimes as instructional designers, learning and development professionals, we don't always interact with the business as much as we might otherwise. And human-centered design is a great way to connect with the product developers, the engineers, other people in the business that we may not always be connected with. So let's talk a little bit about it as a methodology. So you may be familiar with ADDIE, right? We are familiar with connecting these learning styles and learning tools to this model. So I want to give you a chance to think about how you use or how you develop your own learning design. And you might be using ADDIE, but you might also be using SAM, a successive approximation model. And with SAM, we're getting more into an agile learning process. So we're thinking about the background, and then we are getting our preparation stages in the works and understanding what is the challenge that we're focusing on and what do we need to work on. And we are getting into the prototyping stage next. And you can see with SAM that we start thinking about prototyping as our first tool set. And then we review what we have created, and then we design it again. So you are going in this cycle of getting more and more information from your users, from your learners as well. And then you start to actually implement it. So the successive approximation model is a little bit different from ADDIE because you're prototyping really early before you actually launch your product or your e-learning or your ILT as well. And then you're also evaluating it. So I'm curious if we have any thoughts or questions so far.
So Kristen, a few comments have come in. We have an individual who says they want a better understanding of human-centered design.
We will get there.
We had somebody who said they've never heard of human-centered design, and so they're anxious to learn.
Yep.
Another individual is interested in knowing some advice for incorporating HCD into simulations.
All very good questions. So my hope is that actually the simulation question, we will be able to play around with that a little bit through the activity that I have for you today. And what is HCD? If I've never heard of it before, I think that we'll get to that in just a moment as well. So I'm glad all of you are coming with those kind of varied questions. I think this is a tool that you can very easily put into your daily work, even in many small ways. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So just thinking about how you are designing learning now, you might be using Addy, you might be using SAM, you might be using a little bit of both. But let's take a look at the human-centered design model. So this model is probably one of the more complex visualizations, and I'm going to show you one that's a little bit easier to wrap your arms around in just a minute. And this is from the Grameen Foundation that uses human-centered design to produce new solutions across the globe. And you will find human-centered design in a lot of areas that are not learning and development or training and development. You'll find it in social services, you'll find it in product design and development, you'll find it even in engineering and technology product development. But with human-centered design, instead of thinking about the end product or the end solution, we're actually thinking about the end user or the end learner first. So let's take a look at the model that I like a little bit better. So the way that you start human-centered design is you actually start thinking about who you are working for or who you are going to develop this learning experience for. So you've got develop personas there first. And we'll talk about what a persona is and what you do with a persona in just a moment as well. Then you also think about empathizing with this person. So your interest is in understanding who they are, where they're coming from, what challenges they're facing, and we're actually going to do an activity to help us empathize as well. You also are framing the challenge. And this is an interesting shift away from some of the other models. You'll notice that the challenge or the problem statement is not the first element in the human-centered design model. You are framing the challenge a little bit later because you are actually framing your challenge as it's informed by what you've learned about your learner or your end user. And that helps us clarify the challenge that we're actually going to be creating solutions for. Then you've got ideate, and this is a stage where you're coming up with tons and tons of ideas. Quantity over quality is the key here, and you will get a ton of ideas, and we're going to do some exciting things too with that are maybe a little crazy or outside of your comfort zone. And then you're into prototyping. So this is similar with the SAM model. You're actually starting to build pilots. You are trying to do mini simulations instead of a full game simulation, depending on how you're doing your game. And then after you've prototyped, you've gotten experience, you're going to test it and implement it. Now you'll notice there are arrows at the bottom coming back and back and back to each part of the model. And that's because this is not a linear process. It is a cyclical process. So I want to stop here and see if there are any questions or thoughts so far. Doing okay? Good.
Doing good.
All right, so the final thing you'll see underneath the test bubble is to keep repeating, and this is the key to human-centered design. We're never done, it's never perfect, and we're always in a state of flow and flux with this. So knowing that our learners change and their needs change all the time is one of the great reasons that I like to use human-centered design to create solutions for them. Okay, so I want to take a look at reasons why we might use it, and then we're going to take a look at real life example of this in process. So why human-centered design in learning? Well, number one, it is learner focused, not outcome focused. And this might sound a little bit challenging at first because we are so focused on our learning objectives, rightly so. You can't create something that is really worthwhile to a learner if we don't know why we're creating it or we don't know what they're going to get out of it. So it is really important to create objectives. But it's also important to think about the end user. Do we have any questions so far?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
So Janet is asking, how do you determine your particular personas?
How do you determine your particular personas? We're going to get there. I keep saying we're going to get there, and I promise we will. But it's a really good question, and I'll answer part of it now and a little bit later as well. So your personas, and let me flip back here. We're discovering our personas first. We are going to be very, very specific with the person that we're designing learning for. So I'm going to give us three options to actually try to create a learning experience throughout this human-centered design model, and you'll see how we can get really specific about who the learner is and how to develop that persona. So that's the first half of my answer, and I'll get to the second half in a little bit. Any other thoughts or questions that we should address?
Not right now.
Okay. All right, so like I was saying, learner-focused, not outcome-focused, and you'll see that in a minute. We're not seeking to produce a very particular end result. We're seeking to produce an environment in which our learner can learn and reach the outcome on their own. So this is really about producing a tool set for the learner. Rather than saying, this is what you will learn, we are going to the learner first and identifying what is it that they actually need so that we produce the right set of circumstances and the right set of tools for them. The second thing, big reason for me why I like using human-centered design in learning is that it's knowledge retention geared. It is very experiential, and so it is geared at helping that learner really retain knowledge through experience, because we have really, really tailored our learning design to their needs based on their previous experience as well. And we'll talk a little bit about how to develop that understanding of their previous experience too. And finally, it's regenerative. And this is one of my favorite things. Because it is such a cyclical model, we are always testing, we're always learning and coming back with new ideas and new problems to solve. And that is something that we can engage our learners in too, and asking them beyond the traditional evaluation, beyond the traditional survey, what was their true experience here and have we really served their needs? Thoughts and questions?
So we got a question from Salt Lake City, and they're asking, how wide can a human capability be and use HCD effectively?
Okay, let me make sure I understand the question. How wide can a human capability be and still use HCD effectively? So the way that I'm interpreting that question would be perhaps that you're thinking about the objective that you're trying to reach, the outcome you're trying to reach as a capability. And how you would use human-centered design to reach that capability. It can be a pretty wide goal. So we'll talk about three examples that can be as wide or as narrow as you want them to be. So my concern here with human-centered design is actually to be more specific on the learner's experience and what they really need through the persona process than we are on the actual outcome process. So if that's the way that that question is being interpreted, hopefully that helps. And if you want to send some clarifying questions, I would be happy to take a look at that.
And do you have time for a new question?
I do have time for a new question.
If personas are specific, how do you create learning opportunities for a varied audience, culturally, ethnically, etc.?
It's a really, really good question. And I think when we were still thinking that learning styles was the way to go, we had that same question with learning styles, right? How do I create something that is for somebody who's a visual learner versus somebody who is more for an audio style, an auditory style? So thinking about multiple experiences, life experiences, cultures, knowledge levels, we are using the personas in human-centered design as a filter. So we are going to be able to say people who fall into this category of persona will be most moved or most affected by our learning experience because we've designed it really specifically for them. That doesn't mean that you can't have multiple personas represented in one learning experience. So you can run an empathy map example or an activity for multiple personas, and in your prototyping stage you will be able to test out your solutions for both of them together, which we'll talk about in a minute. Follow-up question?
And there's a follow-up question about the regenerative characteristics that you're
yes.
talking about. And so, how buried in rework do you become because of the regenerative work? What if you were incorrect about your personas?
you're probably going to be incorrect with your personas, and that's part of the fun part. So think of this as a test. We are in perpetual test mode, and you might be launching or publishing or hitting save on your file and publishing it to your learners, but you are probably going to be wrong, and you're probably going to find out something in your evaluation or something in your testing phase that says that wasn't the right solution for that learner. It wasn't the right moment, it wasn't the design of the experience wasn't right, and that's okay. So human-centered design asks us as learning practitioners to be comfortable with not being right all the time. So that may not be the answer that you were looking for, but I'm hoping that this will help you develop some comfort with testing and prototyping and receiving that information and seeing evaluations that might not be positive evaluations, or we might not be seeing the behavior change that we wanted, even though we thought we designed it, as opportunities instead of challenges. Opportunities to go back to those learners, to go back to the environment, gather more information, and produce something that works better for them. Other follow-ups, or are we good to go? All right, let's take a look at how this works in real life. I'm going to look at the Nordstrom Innovation Lab.
I'm JB Brown, the Nordstrom Innovation Lab Manager, and this is the lab. We work on 1-week experiments. Somebody will have an idea and we'll find a way to figure out how to prove if the idea is going to work. And this week the Innovation Lab is going to be building an iPad app with customer feedback as we go through the week. We wanted to work in the store to make sure that we were getting customer feedback as we worked, so that we were never working on anything that wasn't valued by the customer and only doing things that are delivering value. So we'll be building a feature and testing it until we get to the point where we have something that's good enough that we can just leave the iPad app behind and have this new thing that customers can use.
This is the world's first flash build. It's a flash mob where a software team shows up and builds an application in a surprise location. This is the Nordstrom Innovation Lab, and we're at the flagship store in downtown Seattle. Right now the team is just setting up their equipment to get started. We're going to build an iPad app that helps customers pick the best pair of sunglasses for them. We really don't know what the features are yet. We're going to use customer feedback as we go along throughout the day and the rest of the week in order to build the best thing.
So the next thing we're going to do is a user story map. So we're going to sit here and together outline all the steps the customer would take, and actually even beforehand how they buy sunglasses, like what are the different things that they might do and how that process might change if we have this application. And then we'll actually dig into what we have to build in order to support that process.
So now that we've done a card mapping, we're going to do a paper prototype, and this is something that we commonly do in the Innovation Lab. It's a great way to show what we'd like to do in a rough prototype that we can easily throw out, change, alter based on feedback from the customers. I'll continue building individual paper slides, and our user experience specialist, Tel, will bring the prototype to a customer and say, okay, I have this app and this is a paper version. I'd like you to kind of use it like you would normally use an app, and you can press things, interact with them, and then she'll change out the pages based on how the customer uses it. So it's a similar experience to the iPad, only an analog version.
So it's day 2, and we have our first working prototype of this app. And how it works is I take my first pair of sunglasses, put it on, take a picture, all right, and then I want to compare it to this other pair I've got right here. Put these on, take another picture. I can just hold these up like this and see which one I like better.
Well, Tel and Kim have been talking to people and doing paper prototypes. We've been coding, building an iPad app. We take a stab at something, we look at the paper prototypes that Kim put together. We might take one at a time. Usually we come to the board and we grab the most important feature and we start implementing it. The really cool thing with this flash build is that we have actual real customers. Just today we delivered 4 or 5 different separate features, and I deliver it, swap the iPad with Tel. She'd go and talk to a customer, and 10 minutes later I had feedback from real customers about this thing that I delivered, and it changed how we did the next thing.
And it's been really, really great watching day to day what they've been doing, the team, to get all the feedback from the salespeople, the feedback the salespeople have gathered from the customers. And it's a really interesting process to kind of come in. On Tuesday, we had no idea what this would look like. There was an idea that somebody had to say, people take a lot of pictures of themselves with the sunglasses. It'd be cool if we could show them side by side to help them make the process better. And that was the idea, that was it. They came in, they had nothing built, and they've been building this literally on the spot throughout each day. And by now, we actually have an app, a functioning app that they can go through It's very intuitive to help look at themselves and make the sunglass selection process easier, which is pretty cool to watch.
So yesterday, the sunglass buyer for Nordstrom came down to check out our progress, and she happened to put on polarized glasses and then held up the iPad in portrait view and was surprised that she couldn't see anything because it was black. And we figured out that the polarization of the iPad running up and down and the polarization of the glasses running vertical cancel each other out. You don't see anything. But if you turn the iPad to landscape, you see perfectly fine because the polarization of the two items line up, and it's okay. So it was a pretty good find to be in the store, and she just happened to put on polarized glasses. And so today, first thing we're going to do is switch it to a landscape design and then lock in the aspect ratio of the iPad so customers and salespeople just naturally pick it up and use it in landscape and not try and go to portrait.
Okay, so I'm going to show you what we've been working on the last 5 days. We've added quite a few features over the week. You take a picture, multiple pictures of the customer, and then you can pull them up. You tap the first one, you can see it larger, and then tap the second, and do a side-by-side comparison of each glass next to each other. We also added a feature where you can rename the picture, because we heard from salespeople, if a customer's trying on quite a lot of glasses, it's helpful to be able to know what order they were taken in, and also rename if you want with the brand or some distinguishing feature about the glass. Another feature we added was the ability to zoom. You can zoom in and really get a good detailed look at the frames side by side. Also, to see one of the pictures larger if you want to just better view of one frame. You can flip the camera view as well. Face it forward so the salesperson can take a picture of it like this, or you can flip the camera like so. Take a picture of yourself facing forward. And then at the end of it all, we have a button called New Customer, which just erases all of the images and allows the salesperson to start with a new customer.
We're just trying to put the final touches on the app. Tel talked to a lot of users, and they said that when we went into the compare view, it was unclear where the pictures were coming from and which picture was which. So the animation here is trying to solve that problem, make it a little more clear what's going on. One of the challenges with software is when you're done, right? And I think the answer is really, it depends on how much time you have. At least the most important things got done. So this was time boxed to a week, and we did a week's worth of work, and it seems like what we have now is something that makes customers happy and addresses the main problems, and something that we can track, we have metrics on. So I think we're gonna call that a day.
The application has developed so far. Everything's finished, everything that we've asked for, and even the little roadblocks and glitches that we kind of stumbled across as we used the app during the week has been solved. I think that it's going to be really easy to be able to implement into our sale, and I think that we're going to find a lot of success with the application, whether it's via a selling tool for us or if it goes public into a downloadable format. Whatever happens, I think this was generally quite a success.
All right, so you've just watched the Nordstrom Innovation Lab and one of their their human-centered design experiments that they actually did in a real live store with real live people. So while I'm debriefing some of that, I'm going to answer a couple of questions that came in, and I'm also going to ask for you to share your thoughts and questions about what you just watched as we debrief it. So first things first, let's answer some of the questions that came in.
Certainly. So the first question is, what types of evaluations are useful in the regenerative process, and at what phase do you recommend they occur?
So let's talk about evaluations when we get to the examples, because that's going to give us more meat to talk about, but we will definitely talk about types of prototyping and types of evaluations when we talk about tests. Other thoughts and questions?
And this one is maybe simpler. Do you advocate for designing your learning experiences with your end users as part of the HCD process?
So let me make sure that I get the full question. Do you advocate for working with your learners as you design the process, design the learning experience? So I'm going to take the question to mean what I just said. So yes, the way that I would interpret that question would mean, are you bringing your learners into your instructional design process? And my answer is a resounding yes to that. So that is an opportunity for us to bring our very, learners who are in a very specific job experience into our studio, as it were, and asking them, how do they take in this information? Not just us reading the evaluation from last time or reading the most recent research, which are both incredibly valuable. But when you have a person there in the flesh or on video and they can be a part of your learning design process, you're going to get to a solution that is better for them. So I would say yes to that. Okay, before we debrief the video that you just watched, are there any other questions that we have? Okay, so the video you just watched from Nordstrom Innovation Lab, obviously this is not a learning experience, but it is a product purchasing experience. But I am curious what you thought about it. So tell me what you thought about it as we talk through it. So you saw that it took about a couple of days, a week or so, and they actually brought in designers, developers, user experience experts, people who set up shop in the lab, in the store right there. And they actually started with paper prototypes. And I'd be curious how many of you start with paper prototypes for your work and you start actually hand sketching something out, or you might use a tool that's a tech-supported tool to sketch something out. But they started with paper prototypes after identifying who's this person and what are they looking for. So they found out from interviewing the salespeople and interviewing users that people were having trouble being able to compare the sunglasses. And this is a pretty common problem. I know that when I've gone to buy eyeglasses or sunglasses, you kind of want to know, like, how does this one look versus how does that one look? And you could theoretically take a picture yourself, but you can't see them side by side. So they realized that people wanted to actually compare. So that was the true problem there, that people weren't able to compare. So they were interviewing users, getting their experiences, and observing, which is an important part of interviewing as well, how were people using this store and using the sales process and the sunglass buying process. So after that, they started with paper prototypes, and then they tested those paper prototypes by bringing them to the customers and asking them to physically swipe through, and they would change out the papers based on what the person identified. So that is something we could do as well. I can see you doing that for an e-learning experience very easily. I have personally done that. You can do it for video as well, but we'll talk more about application in a little bit. So after they did their paper prototypes, they actually started to build a lightweight tool on the iPad to do that. And you can see that as they were building that, they ran into challenges like the polarization challenge, and they realized, oh, wow, that's a challenge that we didn't think about. So we have to fix that on the final end result. So they were testing as they were going. They didn't go away to another room outside of where their customers were. They actually developed that in the same space that their customers were, which speaks to that question we had earlier about whether or not you should bring in your learners to your designing experience. And I would suggest yes, you'll get more experience, more of their genuine experiences if you're asking them as you're developing it. Imagine if you were showing them a page from your e-learning, a slide, and actually questioning them right then and there, how would you interact with this? Do you think that you would use this game in this way? Or you were developing a simulation and you could ask them, what do you think you would do next? Or what do you think the point of this simulation is? And are they actually getting to the outcome that you're interested in having them get to? So you can see that after they prototyped, they tested some more, they shipped another version of the tool, and then they closed up that process. And the developer even said, you know, we could work for a long time on this, but when you're done, you're done, or when you're done is when you say you're done. And that's the same thing with learning. I think something that we do as an industry really well is say, this is the deadline and we're going to work and ship it by the deadline. But what if we said, yes, there's a deadline, but we're actually going to keep it sort of in beta mode, and we're going to continue to test it out and see what learners think. So I know there's a couple of questions and thoughts that came in, so I want to take an opportunity to hear from them.
So, first question is, have you used human-centered design for instructor-led training, or is it specific to e-learning?
It's not specific to e-learning. This can be for any learning experience. You could do it for onboarding, you could do it for manager development, you could do it for an instructor-led training. And we'll see why and how in some of the examples that I have for you. Another question?
Was the user the salesperson or the customer? The customer needs instruction for use, but the salesperson needs the tool to, I can't scroll. But
Yes.
yeah.
So who is the real ultimate user and the real ultimate customer? In the Nordstrom example, the customer really was the customer purchasing the eyeglasses. However, you make a really valid point in your question that there's actually two versions of that, right? There's the salesperson who's going to be using this tool to facilitate the process, and then there's the customer who is using the tool to purchase what they want, to compare what they're looking at. And so when we're doing our learning design, if there are multiple stakeholders who have to be involved, let's say you're building a train the trainer, then you have the trainer, and then you also have the end result. So you need to be mindful of both of those things, and we would do different persona sets for each of them. So really good question. Are there other observations about the Nordstrom Innovation Lab experience? Okay. All right, so I want to talk a little bit now about how to apply what we just watched and apply the theory that we're just talking about now to our learning process. So these, I've picked just 4 on this slide of research, objectives, content, and measurement. These are 4 of our main things that we do as learning practitioners and professionals. We research, we understand what's going on in the industry, we create objectives based on what we're truly interested in the learner knowing and being able to perform in the organization. And sometimes if we want to go as far as what do we want the organization to do as a result of this learner learning this information, then we also create content, right? And we measure that content. So I would love for you to share your ideas on the Brand Live chat box about what kinds of ways that you might use, and these are just stabs in the dark, what kinds of ways you might use human-centered design on these 4, or to do these 4 processes. So I'll give some ideas as well as you're typing those in. So with research, so you are completely changing your research process by going specifically to groups of users, observing how they behave, learning more about their full holistic life than you might otherwise be doing. So that is very much a human-centered design process rather than how we might do research, which could be looking at old surveys, looking at industry data, reading articles, very important as well, but now we're getting out of our office and away from the computer and actually interacting with people as well. Then for objectives, we're changing our whole objective creation process with human-centered design because of the step of framing the challenge, and you'll see that as we do the example. Then content as well. So content now, instead of being stable and we've created and shipped one particular product for our content, whether it's ILT or e-learning, a video, or even a job aid, this is something that is fluid and we're continuing to work on over time. And then measurement. We are going to get to the prototyping and testing example that I have for us. But measurement, you're also starting to question, what are the evaluation tools that I'm using, and are they matching the learner's environment and what I'm really trying to do with this information? So it asks us to question what we're doing already. All right. Are there any experiences or thoughts people would like to share with us?
Yes, we have a few comments that came in. So the first comment is one person said that they're considering using HCD as a community of practice.
Yes, that's a great idea.
And then regarding objectives, one comment is asking them what they feel they need to know.
Yes. Asking the learner what they feel they need to know will give you good information, but as all of you as instructional designers and learning professionals know, it doesn't always give us the whole story. And so maybe even DJ, why do you think it might not give us the whole story to ask them what they know?
They're not going to know the holes in the curriculum or holes in a developmental framework.
Right, exactly. They might not know where they've been or where they need to go, or they might not know the context of the environment that they're in, the organization, where the organization is going, and therefore they might not be self-aware. And this is not to say that not every learner is not self-aware, because many are, but they may have limited view of where they are in that developmental process. So we do want to ask the learner, but we're going to talk about ways to ask questions that actually get more at really specific experiences of the learner, which will tell us where they are in that developmental cycle without them having to tell us, because their answer might be very different than, say, their manager's example or their peer's example, and even our assessment of where they are as well. Are there other questions?
Yes. So for new hire onboarding training, could be useful to ask the person's manager, what are the top 3 essential functions?
Yes. Yeah. And I would hope that you're making sure that those exist in the job description as well. And in your, say, 30-day onboarding plan for that new person, you could even reverse engineer your objectives for that person. So let's say we've got the manager who has shared with us, these are the top 3 functions, and we're hoping that this person will be able to perform these functions by 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, 12 months. What are the experiences that that learner needs to be able to effectively reach those outcomes that we have for them? And human-centered design would be a process of us asking the learners who have already gone through that. So you could go to that manager and talk with the team. What did you have to go through to learn and be proficient in that experience, in that objective that we have? So you might not always be able to talk to the exact person who's going to be your user, but you can approximate that information because, again, this is prototyping, it's testing. We don't have to get exactly the right answer every time. It doesn't have to be perfect. So you can go to the people who might be representative of that user or that learner. Any other thoughts or questions?
There's one more
Okay.
thought, and they're asking, is HCD sophisticated profiling?
Sophisticated profiling. The way that I'm interpreting that question is profiling of a learner and, say, a psychographic or a demographic. And I would say the answer is no. I would say it's more complex than profiling. And I think with profiling, you can run into kind of dangerous territory by saying this learner fits into this bucket because they are a woman and they're, X years old and they have XYZ experience and therefore they only need this kind of learning experience. And that might not be true for that person. So profiling and demographics and psychographics can be helpful for us, but it is the profiling process actually doesn't engage that learner that much. We are observing ourselves and making assumptions about it. And in our persona process, we're actually going to talk with them. We're going to sit next to them in their workspace. We're going to watch them on the front line of their job, ask them about how they do their job, and that will effectively give us our persona and our profile. So I think it's slightly different. Really good questions. I want to make sure that we move through so you can see the examples as well. So we'll catch up with other questions in just a little bit. Okay, so I want you to internally choose a theme for yourself. These are 3 examples that I have for you. One is sales enablement. So you've been tasked with helping a junior sales team ramp up really quickly on their product. So their product in this example is a software tool. That's example number 1. So if you'd like to do that one, go ahead and pick it. Example number 2 is anti-harassment. So you've been tasked to reimagine this program because it hasn't been working. And I will leave it up to you about what that means, hasn't been working, but it's just not sufficient and the executive team has asked you to redesign it. And the third example is a train the trainer for production for feedback. So for those of you in healthcare or manufacturing, this might be a really good example to try. You've been tasked with helping production managers learn a feedback program that you've developed. So you've already developed the program about giving feedback and sharing that feedback, and now you're developing the train the trainer so someone else can do it. So the formula here that I'm going to ask you to use is picking a theme and keeping that theme in mind when we go through each one of our examples. So through the next part of the work that we're going to do today, I will pause a lot so that you get an opportunity to think through this and actually use some scratch paper and draw some examples for yourself. So if you hear some quiet, that's why you're hearing quiet. Okay, so I hope you've got your theme, and I want to start with understanding personas. This is the very first part of our human-centered design process, and there were a lot of questions about personas and how they might be different than profiles, so we'll talk about that now. So you're starting by knowing the who, and this is a really specific who. We're going to do what's called an empathy map in just a moment, and that will help us understand what the person really wants and needs. So notice that we're going away from, the deep demographics, the deep psychographics of this, and we're moving toward what is it that they need in their environment that they're in right now. So I want to use a tool called an empathy map. An empathy map asks you to envision a specific person. You can make up their name, make up the experience that they're in. I would suggest making one up that matches the theme that you chose for your example. And we're going to start thinking in 4 buckets. We're going to wonder, what is this person thinking about in their day-to-day experience? What are they seeing? what are they feeling and what are they doing? Now, don't get too hung up in the differences between these buckets. Some people might say, well, is that a thought, or are they seeing this and then interpreting it as a thought? Doesn't matter. Our point here is to just gather up a lot of information about this person, and so that we can understand where they're coming from in their particular environment. So let's take a look at an example empathy map. So I did this example a couple of days ago. It's Jane. She has, I think I put 35 years old. She's got 3 people under her. She's a sales manager. So I'm doing the sales training example, and I just split my paper into 4 quadrants, and your empathy map does not have to be fancy. As you can see, I just used a legal pad. So I've got my thinking quadrant, my seeing, my feeling, and my doing, and I just jotted some examples there. So examples like she's thinking that she's really overwhelmed, she's feeling that she's really stressed, or she's feeling pride in her sales team. She's seeing that her sales team is working really hard, but she's also seeing that other people are getting to hire more, and she feels like she's overloaded. And then she's on phone calls, she has to be on 4 flights a week. She's doing mentoring because she has junior sales reps. So this is our individual here. We are trying to really fully understand what's going on here. And to create this empathy map, this is our assessment of the situation. So you could do this in your office. Earlier I said, get away from the computer, get away from the office. This is kind of our test. We're gonna just jot this down before we go out and interview, before we go out and try to empathize with this person. So I'm gonna give you a minute or so to actually do this work. So I'll leave my example up so you can see that example. So take a moment to try this out yourself with somebody. And if none of those examples work for you, you can use something that you're working on right now. All right, so now that you've written out some of your examples, let's move on to the next step. So you're gonna summarize your findings. So take a moment to think about your customer's needs. Based on what you just gathered from them, what are they trying to accomplish? What is our sales manager really interested in accomplishing? She's not really interested in accomplishing checking training off the box. She's actually interested in making sure that her junior team members are making their quota, that they're learning, that they are growing in their career. That's what's interesting to her. That's what she needs. So that's the next step that you would do. You would summarize your findings, and then you would go and interview your customer. So I would go call Jane, or I would go sit with Jane, maybe even with her own customer or with her own team, and I would gather up all of my open-ended questions about her. So I'm going to give you less than 2 minutes. The slide says 2 minutes, but we're just going to take a couple of seconds. I want you to jot down some open-ended questions that you might ask when you interview your customer, your learner ultimately. So you just did a persona on them, your empathy map, and think of a couple of open-ended questions you could ask them. Okay, so now you're going to move on to step 3. So list down any insights. Did you learn anything new by talking to your customer? Was there anything unique about their experience that you weren't aware of? Maybe Jane actually loves flying and she wishes that she could access her information via mobile application instead of a PDF or instead of e-learning, and you didn't know that. Maybe on the survey it said something different. So this opportunity you have to interview your customer is where you're really going to dig in and get the meat out of it. And then you're moving on to the next problem statement. So this is the real big difference from the ADDIE and the SAM model. With the ADDIE and the SAM model, someone, either you or someone, has said, this is the problem and we're going to solve it by doing X. with human-centered design, you haven't said, this is the problem and we're going to solve it with X. You're saying, I think this is the problem. This is my hypothesis of what the problem is, but we're going to listen to what our users are saying, our learners are needing, and we're going to try to answer that. So the formula I like to use is, how might I blank? And so I would encourage you to think about, how might I help Jane get that information faster? Or how might I help Jane teach her junior sales team how to reach their quota faster, if that's what you find out is the real need here. Because oftentimes there's a difference, and as instructional designers we know this. Sometimes the business says, well, this is really the need, and you realize, well, that's not a learning need, or that's a different thing. That's an organizational change problem rather than a learning problem. So this gives you the opportunity to really clarify that with the learners. And then you're actually going to test your problem statement. So you're going to ask yourself a couple of questions. Is the question focused on the ultimate impact? And the impact here is for your learner. Remember, it's for your learner. Then, does the question allow for a variety of solutions? Because with our ideate stage, we actually want to come up with as many possible solutions, even off-the-wall ones, as we can. That will give us a lot of options to choose from. And then third, does the question take into account context and constraints? So I want to check here, are there any thoughts or questions that have come up?
There is a question.
Okay.
Can you replace a problem with a goal?
You could replace a problem with a goal, as long as the goal is informed by what the person, the learner, is actually trying to reach. So, for example, you could say the goal is for the organization to move forward into a new market. That's not specific enough, and you'll see that in this example, the testing your problem statement, too broad, just right, too narrow. It's kind of a Goldilocks situation. That goal is too broad. So how would you take that goal down a couple of notches to make sure it's relevant for the user? Really good question. All right, so make sure that your question fits in that just right category. And then you're on to the fun part. This is my favorite part. It's the generating ideas, the ideation part. And you can see I've marked out a couple of things. Your only goal here is quantity over quality. And this is probably something that you do on your own. You're actually thinking about, well, how could I use maybe this tool, or could I do something interesting with this? You're thinking about solutions when you're doing your instructional design, whether it's ILT, a simulation, or e-learning, something else. But this, I'm asking you to come up with like dozens of ideas, many more than you're regularly used to. Now, remind yourself, you are not here to shoot down your ideas, and if you're doing this with other people, we are not shooting down ideas. We're not having the conversation of, well, that's not feasible, or we don't have the money for that. In this particular phase, every idea goes. And what we're also not doing is questioning the validity of an idea. We are just trying it out. So, ways to get yourself kind of out of your comfort zone with this is actually to go way out of your comfort zone. So try thinking of some solutions in a different context. So for example, maybe one of our solutions for Jane was to provide her with a mobile app that we found that we can use for free, and that would give her flashcards for mentoring her junior sales team to help them ramp up. So maybe that's one idea that we had. Now we have to think about it in a crazy context. So I've given you 3 examples here, and I'm going to give you a minute or so to think about that. So imagine a couple of ways to make this work for giraffes. And I'll give you an example because this really is out of the ballpark here. What about how you could work this on the moon? Or how would this work without sound? Do you need sound for this? So the example that I like to give, I was giving this workshop at a county experience, and the county included a couple of people who worked at the library. And we were talking about, well, how could their solution work for giraffes? Giraffes are really tall, right? Their head is kind of far away from their body. If a giraffe needs to reach something at the library, they're probably going to reach for the tallest shelf and not the bottom shelf. So maybe we have to put the books that are more relevant to the giraffe on the tallest shelf, and that would inform our organization strategy. So that's a little bit far out there, but the whole purpose of this brainstorming is to just get ourselves out of the comfort zone and try a bunch of different ideas. So, questions and thoughts?
We have a question about the previous slide about testing.
Yes.
And so they're asking, are you testing the problem statement, and can you give an example?
Yes.
So again, with the Amy's example, maybe her goal or problem statement is to increase sales.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. For example, let's say our person is interested in increasing sales. I think I'll use Jane's example as interested in equipping the junior sales team with the tools they need to reach their quota. So you can see some examples on the slide here, the too broad. How might I redesign the sales enablement program? That's a big problem, right? That's departments worth of questioning and thinking and resources, and we can't really get our arms around that. So it's too broad to work on that. But on the other end of the spectrum, you're asking, how might I build an e-learning course to teach reps how to sell our product? Now that's really, really specific. That might well be a great solution, and that could be something that you actually end up doing. However, with that question, you've decided the solution in your problem statement. So we don't want to decide the solution in our problem statement, and that's how you get to the middle, the just right. So how might you equip our junior sales team to better educate customers on the product so that they're ready to purchase, right? So that's actually building a skill set for that team member so that the sale happens a little bit easier. And it doesn't give us the solution. We don't know how we're going to equip the team to do that. We just know that that's what we need to do to help them move forward in their goal. So the way you test it is by asking yourself, is this too big to get my arms around and I can't effectively give an answer to that? Or is this too small that I've actually put my solution in my problem statement? Really good question. Any other questions? All right. Okay, so I hope you've come up with a couple of crazy ideas. We're going to move forward, pretend that you have if you haven't. But we're going to actually start sketching out our ideas. This is right before we're prototyping. So I really encourage people to actually physically draw something, and that may not be your comfort level, but sometimes just drawing out some stick figures, ways to meet your customers' needs, even a map. You could draw somebody reaching from this point all the way to that point. So I'm going to give you a minute just to sketch out some ideas here. Okay, so now you've sketched out a couple of your ideas, and this could look like anything. Now we're going to move on to prototyping solutions. So this is really the fun part. I think ideation is really a fun part, and prototyping is a fun part. You're actually sketching out what might some ideas for putting this out into the world look like. So you could prototype out your e-learning or your game simulation. This is just a sketch that I've pulled from another team, and they've just prototyped out, here are some examples of how we could build this in our ecosystem. So prototyping can mean I'm going to use a focus group to test out some paper versions of my slides. Or I'm going to have a pilot group. Maybe you want to roll something out to 1,000 people. Your pilot group could be 10, and you could roll it out to them and get their feedback. And that way you turn it around much, much faster. And if you realize, oh wow, we really didn't hit the mark on this, you've actually really moved it forward pretty quickly. So prototyping is your next stage. Then you are actually moving into bringing it to life. So one of the tool sets, we're actually not going to go deep into it today, but I've provided it to you in the worksheet that you can take home, is the consumer experience map. And you could call it a learner experience map. And you're actually marking out what is their experience of this learning process in every stage. So what about before they come to your learning experience? Let's say it's ILT. What about before they come to the classroom? What's happening as they are listening to the introductions? What's happening in the middle of the class? What's happening at the end? And what happens when they go back? And what happens 30 days after they've left your training? So how would you apply this customer experience map to yours? That's the really good question. Identify what are the stages in your learner's process, and then draw out what's actually happening here, and use that to inform your prototype and tweak your prototype before you ship the final example, or excuse me, the final product. Okay, designing tests. This is the part where people have a lot of questions about evaluations. And we have our traditional evaluation models. We know level 1, level 2, level 3. We understand all of that. And here I'm asking you kind of 3 simple questions. Decide what you want to test. So this is kind of like if when you were in chemistry in high school, you're testing one variable at a time. So let's say I want to test how well people actually take in the information, right? So that's meaning that I'm not really asking, how did they learn from it? I'm asking, were they able to access the information? So let's say they told me, well, mobile is really better for me. And turns out that they're not actually accessing it from the app, they're going in through their email. So that's taught me something really interesting, and I tested it by just asking them. I could have also designed a survey. I could have designed a set where I listen in on phone calls. You could do a number of tests that are relevant to the experience that you're actually working with right now. So you're creating the few test methods. And then you're determining how you would find success or failure. So you're actually marking out, what does success look like for this? So how do I know I've done a good job with this and I'm good to move forward with the next step? Or how do I know I've really not done a great job and I need to actually go back to my prototyping or back to my customer interviews? So those are your metrics, and you're defining that based on what your goal for the learner is and what their real needs are, which you found out in the persona work that we did. And I've given you a tool in your worksheet, the customer feedback framework, and this allows your customer, you can use this as an interview tool when you're testing. Let's say that you've actually rolled out your pilot and you have a focus group of 10 people and they've gone through your paper version of your e-learning module. You can actually give this framework to them and they can write it in, or you can ask questions and you write it in. So this is really a handy tool that I would encourage you to download and try at home. And the thing that I want you to take home about this slide is focus on the learning, not the validation. And some people call this the mom test. And for most of us, our moms love all of our ideas, or your dads love all of your ideas. And they say that we're always great, and that reinforces our belief, right? So that's a cognitive bias, and we don't want to reinforce our belief. We're not seeking to be right here. We're seeking to have designed something that is best for the learner. And if the data that we get back says this actually wasn't ideal, then that's not taken personally for us. We take that as data from our test to inform our next prototype from this. So this framework can really help you. Okay. So as we close up, I want to make sure that we've touched on any other questions. But first, the easy way to remember human-centered design is you're observing, you're asking questions, you are creating something, and you're testing it, and then you're repeating. And just like in the Nordstrom Innovation Lab video, you're done when you think you're done, because you're always going to be changing. This really is a complete shift from how you ship learning materials. So I would encourage you to try this out in a small way, especially if you have leadership that might be reticent to try a new model. Pick something really small that you could get an easy win with, or you have people who are already interested in this or interested in doing a new way. Try it with them first and show that it can work, or just test out your own skill set on that as well. Now, we're going to You'll get the worksheet later, but you can take that worksheet, and on the first page there are a number of extra learning resources in case you'd like to dive deeper into human-centered design. But before we go, I want to make sure that we have addressed any questions and concerns that we have. Any questions, CJ? No? Okay. Well, I want to say thank you for participating in this, and feel free to ask me questions if you want. I am happy to be contacted by email. I also want to say thank you to ATD for sponsoring and holding this event, and also BrandLive for giving us their awesome studio for doing this webcast. And if you've got questions, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.